Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to Temple University Japan campus. I'm Robert Dujarric. I'm the chief butler of this organization. Just two things. If you get an invitation directly from us, you can give me your business card, or we have a box here. And also, we always encourage donations to continue to fund our glorious programs. So we have our voting ballot box, but it's really a money box. And we're extremely happy to Ono Sensei, who's come all the way from Texas to enlighten us. He's a professor at Texas A&M, one of the most famous schools in the US. Studied at Waseda, got his PhD at the University of Chicago. And I was very fortunate to meet him at a lecture he gave at the French-Japanese house. And since he happens to be in Tokyo, he's kindly agreed to speak with us. So he'll speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have our usual Q&A. So, Sensei, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. I'm going to speak in English today, but I can entertain questions in either English or Japanese, whatever you feel comfortable. This is ongoing work. I have several papers, some ongoing and some already published. And it's kind of motivated by my personal experience. I went to school in Japan, and then I started working in a consulting sector called Nomura. And then several years after I started working, I noticed that my really good colleagues were being plucked away into these foreign firms, like ridiculous salaries. We also had people in the economics and securities division that were being headhunted and scouted by these foreign firms over Gaishike. And so basically Nomura was losing their best personnel to this foreign competition. This is like, this went on for much of the 1990s. And back then I was not an academic. And after I became an academic, I wanted to study this phenomenon more systematically, put some theory to this. What's going on. And so the papers that I'm going to talk for the most part about my ongoing paper, but I will show some highlights from my previous publications in 2007 and 2011. And to give you some highlights of what I've done so far, this might seem very obvious to you if you live in Japan, but there's a very clear distinction between domestic and foreign firms in Japan. In the domestic firms, from the perspective of human resources, you see very much the features of like lifetime employment systems. So we have job security, seniority wages, large gender gaps, very low mobility. In the foreign firms, you have people that are behaving more like free agents. Right? So they don't have the job security, but they have higher compensation, and they shop around from job to job. Right? So one of the things that we did is we estimated what's called a foreign wage premium. Okay, so what is the premium for working in a foreign firm? And some estimations, maybe about 10% premium. So no surprise. Again, if you work in Japan, that people that work in foreign firms earn on average 10% more than their domestic counterparts. Right? So from the perspective of workers in domestic firms, what this means is that they're paying an insurance. Right? So insurance to protect them against the market risk, and they're willing to work at 10% lower wages, right? So it's kind of like a trade-off between risk and returns. So this is one of the findings from 2011 paper, and we looked at how wages differ by domestic and foreign firms. And this is what the first picture we're looking at is. This is a picture of a earnings profile in domestic firms. So what we see here is this general work experience. So how much does your wage increase as you get more experience? And tenure is a very interesting concept in labor economics. Is basically how much your wages increase with the duration of the years that you stay with the same firm, right? So similar concepts, but they're measuring different things. Basically, in the Japanese company, you have high returns to tenure, right? So you have a very, very high slope against tenure, a much flatter slope against work experience. So tenure pays off. basically how many years that you spend with the company, there's a huge return in the Japanese company. And in contrast, in the foreign firm, you see the opposite. So there's a huge return to general work experience, and basically no return to tenure. In fact, statistically, I show that the tenure wage profile in the foreign firm is not significant. Right? It basically means it doesn't matter how many years you work for Goldman Sachs. That's not the payoff. It's basically the experience that pays off, and not how much time you spend with the foreign firm. So this is very interesting. If you have any background in in social sciences, you can think this has huge implications for job mobility, right? So if the returns to seniority, if the returns to tenure are big in a Japanese company, then people are going to, there's an incentive to stay there, right? The longer you stay in the same firm, the higher your compensation, whereas it makes absolutely no, there's no benefit to that in the foreign firm. So this is one of the mechanisms that's leading to like job security or lifetime employment in Japan, whereas in the foreign firm you have very little, returns to tenure. Okay, so getting into the current setting, I'm going to talk about like why is this so interesting, right? So, sitting in the United States, you get used to a very high mobility context, right? So when we look at Japan from the outside, there's this, you see this microcosm of people, a labor market that's characterized by very low mobility, and this thing about loyalty and commitment. There's a mystique about the Japanese labor market, whereas in the United States it's more like this free agent, very high mobility context. So what happens when those two labor markets merge? What kind of phenomenon are we going to see? And overall, like we're going to try to see, the effect of foreign firms and how much of a spillover effect does that have on Japanese employment practice as a bigger picture. So the core hypothesis of my work is really, looking at loyalty. Okay, so loyalty, like how do we explain job mobility? Okay, so how do we explain lifetime employment? How do we explain the fact that some people, like in Japan, there's a heck of a less job mobility in Japan compared to the American context. So there's lots more, you can say that there's more loyalty in this country, but where does that come from? So I mean, there's one position is the cultural hypothesis, saying that, well, the Japanese are just genetically, there's something in our genes that makes us very, very loyal. Right? It goes back to the samurais. We're willing to die for the people that we work for, as opposed to the Westerners. Right? The Japanese always had this barbarian view for Westerners that, they will never understand Japanese loyalty. There's something in our genes. It can never be replicated. So, loyalty or culture is given. Whereas this other hypothesis is that high commitment culture in the Japanese labor market is an outcome of the Japanese organization, right? So if you can actually set up these, statistically, you can set up these experiments. We call them natural experiments of like a twin, right? You take two people genetically, everything is identical. You put one person in Sumitomo, the other person in Goldman Sachs. See what happens 20 years later, and that's kind of a controlled experiment, right? And what you find is that the people that work in the Goldman Sachs kind of setting behave completely different from the people that are in Sumitomo. So the implication of that is that loyalty is in fact endogenous. It's created through the organization. And it's not a cultural gift, right? So that's the kind of experiment and settings that we're looking at. And so we're going to look at some examples of that, looking through quantitative analysis and some interviews that I'm conducting. Oh, by the way, is there anybody in the audience that are actually working for foreign firms right now? Oh, I see. That's I'm always looking for people to interview. So, if you're willing to speak to me, maybe we can talk after the presentation. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I'm here. So I'm spending the fall semester in sabbatical. I'm talking to people at these foreign investment banks. So, if there's an opportunity, I'd like to speak to you at some time. So this is Liar's Poker is a book that came out in the United States, 1980s, height of the Wall Street boom, and basically talks. Liar's Poker. This quote says, loyalty. There's no such thing as loyalty in Wall Street, right? Loyalty is a sucker's game. Loyalty. So what I'm saying here is that loyalty in the Japanese context pays off, right? So you remember that 10-year waste profile. There's huge returns to staying with the same firm. In the American context, there isn't one, right? So loyalty pays in Japan, but loyalty does not pay in Wall Street. So in sociology, we would say, well, there's people are behaving rationally, but the rationality depends on the institutional context, right? So the context is really important here. This is a schema that I'm working on right now. When we look at market as an environment and market as an organization, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip forward to this example here. And so what we have is, geographically speaking, this is Japan right now. So market as the environment is basically like a country that's where price mechanisms operate very low. And this is a high context environment, so like the United States. So this would be like Wall Street, this is Tokyo. And then within those constraints, we have these market organizations. So we have an American company and a Japanese company, right? So this is what we call the embedded corporation. So in this particular example, we have like Nomura Securities Japan. In Japan, here we have a high marketness company in a high marketness context. This would be Goldman Sachs in the United States, right? So I think that if you compare these two, you're going to see really, really extreme differences, right? But what this schema does is that we're going to control for the organizational environment and see, okay, let's try to look at the same Japanese person, put one person in a high market environment, the other person in a low market environment, and see if we can observe any differences. Right, so basically, I'm going to try to look at these behavioral differences controlling for the environment. Okay. So some of the theory that I talked about in the full paper, if anyone is interested, is that we have what we call the internal labor market setup. In the case of domestic firms in Japan, and this is going back to the classics. Like so, in Japan, there's a labor market within the organization. So people generally start from the bottom. You recruit new graduates at the bottom. You train them in-house. You promote them internally, and then they go up. What we call this upward spiral through job rotation. They get tremendous training. They develop firm-specific skills, and that in turn constrains the mobility. Foreign firms, the port of entry is open at all levels, right? So not just new graduates, but mid-career hires, executives. The port of entry is very open, in say we call the boundaries of ports. But on the other hand, there's very little job training taking place and very little job security. Okay, so those are some of the differences. Then in the social science, we have this concept called social capital. Social capital is much like human capital, and this is like the network, or like the resources embedded between individuals and organizations. So, we talk about like professional networks, right? And those networks can be inside the firm or between firms. And just like with the concept of human capital, we have this thing called firm-specific social capital. That there are social networks that can develop in-house that cannot be transferred outside of that firm. Okay. So these are some of the concepts that will come up as we go through these findings. So let me talk a little bit about the setup. The data that I'm using is this database of finance specialists taken by Nihon Life, Nissei Sokenkyujo. And on top of that, I'm also using I created this database using the Nikkei Kinyu Shimbun of analysts. So in case I didn't say this before, I'm going to focus specifically on the finance sector because the previous papers that I wrote was was not industry specific, and some people complained that, well, you can't generalize across all industries. This one's going to focus exclusively on the finance sector. Okay, and this is how I coded the information from the security analyst database. So this is typically like the entry that you find in the Dekinu Shimbun. And then I coded that information for about approximately 300 individuals, and I was able to construct these job histories of 300 analysts. Okay, so before we get too much into that, the boringness of the data, let me just show you what kind of people that we're talking about. So this is one of the things that I did in this work is that, okay, we're going to look at finance sector, domestic versus foreign firms, but not all domestic and foreign firms are the same, right? So is there any way we can rank them? And I looked at this publication called Institutional Investor, okay? So this is the ranking, a snapshot of the ranking of security analysts between 1997 and 2003. You can see, I mean, the red ones are domestic firms, okay? So, I mean, very, very clear that Nomura dominates the top of the rankings of security analysts. And then there's a couple of others like Daiwa and MIT Securities, but most of them are dominated by foreign firms. And by the way, like Robert said, I was trained at Chicago. I can entertain questions at any time. If you need to ask any questions for clarification, whatever, please do so. Okay, so usual suspects, right? Nomura at the top, and Daiwa after that, and then followed by a whole bunch of foreign firms. So in this way, I classified what we call the top domestic firms, which is Nomura and Daiwa Securities, and top foreign firms comprised of these groups, and see if there's going to be any differences, in mobility patterns, if we make this distinction. Okay, this is this work actually involves a lot of data handling and econometrics. I'm not going to have time to talk about that today. I'll be happy to do that if you're interested. But there's this, there's a process correct for selection. If you think about the people that work in domestic and foreign firms, they're not randomly selected, right? So this slide basically talks about who. First of all, let's look at who works in the foreign firms. And sure enough, we find that there are systematic differences between the people that work in domestic versus foreign firms. The finance professionals in the domestic firm is like the typical Japanese salaryman, right? Male, Japanese university graduate, generalist. Okay? And in the foreign firm counterpart, more likely to be female, graduate from a foreign university, and a specialist. She also has better English skills. One of the interesting questions is that ask about English skills. And unsurprisingly, people that work in IC for the foreign firms have better English skills. Okay, so those are the kind of that's the profile of the people that are working in the foreign firms. And so now we're going to look at these are regression results looking at how many times these people have changed jobs. Okay, so looking at the Nippon Life data set, of course the first thing you notice is that if you're working in a foreign firm, you have a higher propensity to change jobs, highly significant, and you get the same results with the security analyst database. Okay. The other thing, which I don't have too much time to talk about today, is that there's a dummy variable for foreign national, right? So, are you a Nihonjin or a Gaijin? Okay, and all this, this cultural hypothesis again, in that loyalty and high commitment, it's a Japanese trait. What if you put this foreign national dummy in there? And it's absolutely not significant, right? Basically meaning that it doesn't matter if you're foreign or not, you move in the same way. Okay, so that foreign national was insignificant. And then we look at what happens when we break down these firms into different categories, different ranks. Okay, so the reference category is top domestic firms. So this is Nomura and Daiwa. So they are, as you can see, everything else is positive, which means that if you work for Nomura and Daiwa, you have a significantly lower chance of moving, right? So people in Nomura and Daiwa are generally happy perhaps because they are working in a top domestic firm. And if you're working in other places like other domestic or top foreign, you have a higher likelihood of moving. Okay, and so these are simulation results. Both basically show the same thing. That people in the domestic firms are significantly less likely to move. Basically, the majority do not move actually, and the people in the foreign firms have a higher number of job moves. Okay, and a couple of interview results here, basically confirming that yes, if you work in a foreign firm, there's little resistance to move. But also, there's some interview results saying that, well, there's less resistance to moving if you work in a foreign firm, but even within a foreign firm context, there is a limit, that some people actually have moved 6 times since they started working, and that's not a very good sign, right? There could be a stigma if you move too much. Okay, so these are some of the survey results and what we're looking at here is that this is just singling out the foreign firm coefficient. So the way to look at this is these are survey results, right? So like the first line would say people that work in foreign firms are significantly more likely to be hired by short-term contracts. Right? So people don't have these implicit long-time contracts that the Japanese employees enjoy, but they're actually hired on short-term contracts that have to be renewed on an annual basis. This one says, my boss is an inbred. Okay, so in Japanese, the word is hainuki. So my boss is basically somebody that was promoted internally. So in the Japanese context, people are really more likely to be working for bosses that are promoted internally, whereas in the foreign context, people are more likely to be working for bosses that came from outside. Right? So there's interesting interview results saying, okay, how could you place loyalty to a company if your boss is shopping around for jobs, right? Again, different context. I'm not going to have time to go through each and every one of these questions. I'm going to move on. Some results from the training side. Overall, the workers in the foreign firms are more likely to express desire for more training, right? So, so there's less training taking place in the foreign firms. And the workers, in fact, in the foreign firms, they actually want to be trained more. Okay? Other interview results saying, well, yeah. So obviously these people in finance are very, very rational people, right? So their advice to university graduates would be like, don't start off in a foreign firm. They're not going to train you. Go to Nomura, go to Daiwa, go to Mitsubishi. You get the training, you get certified, then you can come to the Daishi. Right? It makes more sense that way. It does, but it's of course it's a very rational thing to say. Another interview saying that foreign firms are basically not interested in training you. Okay. So what this does is that you start to see this scenario where, okay, so the top domestic firms become feeders, right? So they're basically training. They provide tremendous training to these finance professionals. And then eventually, those workers get scouted into the foreign firms. So these domestic firms are feeding, they're training, giving away the human capital. They're feeding their best workers into the foreign firms, like it or not. Another thing that that I uncovered through my interviews was that there's a lot of team mobility going on. Okay, so in the financial sector, apparently, there's people tend to work in teams, right? So traders, analysts, underwriting, etc. They work in teams. So there's actually lots of stories of people moving in entire sections. There's an M&A, mergers and acquisitions team at Merrill Lynch, where the entire team disappeared, because the section head started his own company and took all the people with him. Right? So all of a sudden, the M&A section at Merrill Lynch was vacated, and they had to scramble to fill those positions. Okay. A couple more interview results saying that there's a strong presence at Morgan Stanley. At one time, there was a strong presence from Nomura. Other companies, there was strong presence from Daiwa, but since they just kind of moved on. So lots of team mobility going on. And the other thing is that, I discovered is that, Japan, after all, is a very hierarchical society. And so these people talk a lot about maintaining this really good ties with your bosses, right? That if you if you maintain a good relationship with your boss, then they will take care of you afterwards. And they'll remember you, and then they will, like once they move to a different company, they will call you and try to scout you out. Okay, so there's a lot of social capital building that takes place within these teams, okay, which ultimately can be very valuable. Okay, these are some of the reasons for changing jobs. Yes, a lot of it has to do with compensation, but the other aspect of that is self-recognition and self-esteem. Right? So this was a very interesting interview. Of one person that moved to JP Morgan, and said, well, JP Morgan was like playing in the major leagues. Like Mitsubishi, it's kind of like Yomiuri Giants, but I got this offer to play in the major leagues, and how can you say no? Okay? And it kind of reminded me of these Japanese baseball players like Ichiro that really want to go. I mean, the Japanese market is too small. They want to go play in the major leagues. And if the New York Yankees ask you to play, you just can't say no. Okay? So the same person was basically like, if Nomura had asked me with the same offer, I would basically decline. I just accepted because it was from a foreign firm. Okay. Reasons for not changing jobs, and so in this kind of a industry, it seems like there's a high mobility, and in fact there is, but some people actually remain where they are. As you saw, like people in Nomura are less likely to move compared to other people, and it has to do with firm-specific social capital. One professional has described it as empire building. In a hierarchical society such as Japan, you start to build your own empire, right? So you have the senpai and the kohai, and then you start to build your little, subordinates and your own section. You build your own network within the firm. And this particular analyst also said that, I like the Nomura brand, and Nomura can move people, and the brand can really help me build an empire. So, some examples of social capital building taking place. Okay, so this is the, so now we're going to talk exclusively about the security analysts, mobility of security analysts. And what this is looking at is, so I said, I don't know if you can see this, but there's 300 analysts here, a total of 300 analysts. And then these are looking at people's mobility patterns, right? So how many times did they change jobs? So we have 300 analysts and 400 job moves, okay? And I codified everything. The one in the box is basically if somebody moved from a foreign to a domestic firm. Okay, so this is like, F to D is foreign to domestic, D to D is domestic to domestic, etc. Okay? So basically what I find is that 95% of the time people are moving from domestic to foreign firms. Okay, and never the other way around, which might make a lot of sense to you, but again, from a social scientist, this is really fascinating. Basically, saying that job mobility is not random. There's a systematic pattern to the way these people are moving. Okay, and looking in more detailed patterns about mobility table. So this is what we call the mobility table. This is the origin. So this is where they started out, and this is the destination where they went, right? So at the very top we have Nomura. There are 68 analysts at Nomura. 35 of them stayed at Nomura, and then the other ones, decided to move on to other destinations. The same with Daiwa and Goldman Sachs, etc. Okay, so the first thing that we can see is that job mobility again is not random. The majority moved from domestic to foreign firms. The domestic firms, there's a lot of outflow. Okay, so there are people leaving domestic firms, so the outflow is greater than the inflow. And the foreign firms, the inflow is greater than the outflow, right? So there are a lot of people that come into the foreign firms rather than going out, okay? And the other thing is, we can talk about this mobility table all day, but I'm just going to show 3 slides of this. So Nomura and Daiwa, so those are the 2 top. There's absolutely no mobility between Nomura and Daiwa, right? Now, in the Japanese context, that might make a lot of sense because those are 2 competitors. But from an economics point of view, like, how do you explain that? I mean, is there something about wage differences? Economists start talking about wage differences about everything, but there seems to be some kind of a barrier to mobility between Nomura and Daiwa. And one analyst said, well, one thing is that if you're going to move, you might as well go to a foreign firm, right? Because they offer higher compensation, and also one of the things is that once you change jobs in Japan, the Japanese firms are difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to go back, right? So if you're going to change jobs, you might as well just go to the foreign firm and start this job hopping cycle, because the Japanese companies will not take you back. Okay. So there's and the other thing is that you can see a little bit of a pattern of team mobility from Nomura to Goldman Sachs. So a top domestic firm to a top foreign firm, right? So, and fewer people going into, like, for example, like the other domestic firms, okay? So there's mobility at the top. So that's another pattern that we can see. And then there's what we call the index of heterogeneity. Okay, so this is the differentiation. So this index basically says if this is 0, then you have a perfectly homogeneous workplace. So everybody, in this case, if that was 0, it basically says that Nomura, within Nomura, if you took a snapshot of Nomura securities right now, everybody is in red. Okay, that would be 0. But there's 5 people from other domestic firms, so they end up being lower in differentiation, but not 0. But if you look at something like Morgan Stanley, you have people coming in from all over the place, right? You have Nomura, Daiwa, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley. There's people coming in from all over the place. So you have a heterogeneous workplace. And in the organization literature, there's a lot of work about turnover and demographic composition of the workplace, right? So the more heterogeneous the work culture is, the higher mobility. So those are pretty very obvious patterns that we can see. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you this network diagram. So this is like in sociology and business, this is what we call a social network analysis. And these hubs, the size of these hubs actually have meaning, and so do the direction and thickness of the arrows. So here we have the biggest hub, which is Nomura. So we have Nomura, the people that work for Nomura are here. And you can see that there's no arrow coming into Nomura, and all the arrows are going out. Right? So that's what I was talking about, feeders. And there's a thick arrow going into Goldman Sachs because that's where the biggest mobility took place. And the others are like Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley. And then the second biggest hub happens to be Daiwa. And again, we have no arrows coming in. So the domestic firms are feeding their workers into the foreign firms, and nobody's coming into them. So from a human capital perspective, this is really interesting because it's a tremendous drain on the human capital and the investments that these firms have made. Okay, so those are some of the highlights. Let me just talk about the recent developments on this, because these are some of the recent the stuff that I've uncovered in the last few months. So, talking to just people from the post-Lehman shock, there's been obviously if this kind of brain drain continues from domestic to foreign firms, it's not sustainable, right? The domestic, it's not like this negligible amount of brain drain. There's significant drag on the resources. So the top brokerage firms like Nomura are starting to react to this foreign competition. Okay? So we have short-term contracts, higher compensation. Like Nomura, for example, they have introduced a specialist track, right, specifically to compete against the foreign brokers. So there you have offers and packages that are meant specifically to match the foreign competition in terms of compensation. And what's interesting is that a lot of the Japanese firms are inviting their workers back. Okay, and there was this story from 2001. An institutional investor made headlines because there was a Nomura analyst, that from Nomura to J.P. Morgan, and then back to Nomura. Right? This is just unheard of, in the Japanese context, that somebody actually was called back to work for Nomura because he was such a hot shot. But the story is that he moved on to Lehman, and then to Barclays, and then after that, I completely lost track. And I'm sure that in this very small industry, you probably know who this might be. But yes, that kind of thing does happen. But again, the interesting thing is that Nomura to Nomura, right? And that's something that was quite unheard of back in the day. Okay. So I'm saying that in the post-Lehman shock, there's actually workers that are got downsized, and these people in finance are actually asking their bosses if they can be taken back to them, right? And so there's apparently a little bit of a return migration that's taking place after 2008, where the people in the finance that lost their jobs are being called back to the domestic firms. So the punchline there is that social capital, again, is really important. I mean, you don't want to, when you leave the job with your employer, you don't want to go with a finger in the air, basically. And that maybe there's a possibility that I'm coming back to this firm. Oh, was that being videotaped? I'm sorry. So you want to maintain a good reputation, okay? And so in terms of conversions, what we're seeing is that perhaps Nomura Securities is becoming more market-oriented. This is something I didn't have time to talk about today, but some of the foreign firms are becoming a little bit more Japanese in the sense that they're increasing their market presence, but they're also increasing training opportunities, and they're also stepping up their popularity rankings among university graduates. So there are more people that are willing to seek employment in these firms. And over time, you see that there's some conversions between these two types of organizations. Okay, I'm over my time, so I should stop there.
Thank you so much. I told little sensei that we try to run this very American style, so that I should make comments criticizing you rather than just thank you very much for being so kind to come. But unfortunately, I agree with almost everything you said, which I found very disappointing.